Packing up my car before heading out to Charlotte to spend Christmas with my family, and then eventually, obviously, head down to Austin after that. So I'm going to take a brief break and talk about something that I think is it's an interesting sort of debate that I see different instructors having. Should we teach white belts leg locks? Really, like what people mean most of the time is should we teach white belts heel hooks, right? Because I I see people teaching ankle locks to white belts all the time. That doesn't really seem that controversial to me. It's really more so heel hooks, right? One way of looking at this is that, well, if you wouldn't mind teaching white belts arm locks, why would you, distinguish that from heel hooks? I don't really think this is actually a very good argument because at the end of the day, a knee injury is much more significant than anything that can be done to your elbow. Now, you could argue that damage to your shoulder is comparably bad, but I think the difference is that, like, to bust someone's shoulder up with a Kimura requires a higher degree of, like, sensitivity and understanding to what you're doing than with, like, a heel hook where, like, an inside heel hook, you could, like, just sort of blast it like a moron and bust someone's shit up without even really realizing what you just did, right? So, or somebody could twist the wrong way. It's hard to twist the wrong way with a Kimura, for instance, right? So, yeah, I think those arguments aren't really super solid. So, are there any arguments which we could use to possibly, justify teaching white belts heel hooks? Yeah, I usually do teach white belts heel hooks. I'll teach people heel hooks at every level. The reason that is that, yes, I do agree they are more dangerous than, like, let's say, arm locks or shoulder locks. But I would also argue that there are a lot of other techniques that we teach to white belts and we should teach to white belts that are more dangerous than arm locks, right? Like, for instance, takedowns. Certain dynamic movements I think are going to be much more dangerous than an arm lock, but we still teach them the white belts, and I think rightfully so. Jiu-jitsu is a combat sport. There's always a certain degree of danger. Obviously, like, the goal is to have it be as safe as possible, but you're not going to ever completely remove danger. A better strategy, in my opinion, from trying to completely remove danger, which is obviously kind of like a fantasy, you're never going to do that, is instead to try to figure out, okay, how can we mitigate the injury risk? In the case of heel hooks, you're going to mitigate injury risk through having an understanding of how these locks function, and what that means first and foremost is, like, teaching your students defense. When you spread throughout your school a culture of understanding, like, actual technical heel hook defense, right? The injury rate's gonna plummet, right? The safety rate's gonna skyrocket. Let's talk about, like, what does it mean to say intelligent heel hook defense? Well, here's what intelligent heel hook defense isn't: being a warrior. So if you get caught in a heel hook and your defense is, I'm just gonna be a warrior, I'm not gonna tap, that's not good defense. Like, yeah, I mean, you see that, like, at the high level sometimes where people just eat shit and the stuff goes out and they just keep fighting. But, like, that's that's not what anyone should be doing, least of all white belts in the training room, right? A better strategy is to teach people how to hide the heel. It's not even a hard movement to do. Like, you can learn how to hide your heel in, like, fucking one day. Like, point the back of your knee into their hips and then extend your toes. There you go. You just learned how to hide your heel. I just taught all you guys how to hide your heel right now. Now, the trick is, of course, being able to apply that knowledge in an actual, like, frantic situation where you're rolling or you're competing, right? You try to remember those 2 points. I'll point the back of my knee into his hips and point my toes. You're going to fuck it up a lot, right? That's natural. That's kind of like a part of, like, learning something that's mechanically complicated to perform, right? What you want to make sure is that you have your students constantly working with this intelligent defense in mind. And the guy applying the heel hook, it's the same safety precautions as with any joint lock. He's not, like, being a lunatic, right? Like, first and foremost, when you're applying a joint lock in training, your primary concern should be my training partner's safety. Your secondary concern should be, am I doing the move right? I just realized that as I talk in these stories, I'm wearing a t-shirt where a guy is heel hooking someone else. That wasn't deliberate, but I guess it fits. Yeah, so, like, anyway, like, I can go on about this topic for a while, but I just want to go over some brief thoughts that were on my mind so I could take a break from packing and shit. I have spent like years teaching classes to people of all sorts of belt levels, and many of them being white, and I've always taught them heel hooks, and I've never had in any of my classes anyone ever get hurt with a heel hook. I don't think I've ever had any injuries, actually. Now, maybe that's just luck. I tend to think it's not. I tend to think it's like, obviously there's a degree of luck, right? But there's also the fact that I'm taking certain safety precautions very, very seriously, right? And so I think that this kind of like, obviously this is anecdotal, but for me, I don't really think heel hooks are so dangerous that you can't teach them to new students. Another interesting question to ask is, should we not teach white belts heel hooks or any leg locks whatsoever because of the pedagogical disadvantage in terms of their overall development, right? So if you teach, the argument here would be that if you teach a white belt or a beginning student leg locks, there's a certain degree of accessibility, okay, to leg locks in terms of like immediate access, right? That's an advantage, but it's also in a sense like a temptation to constantly exclusively go for them, right? Because you can experience, especially at the lower levels, a lot of immediate short-term success with leg locks, especially heel hooks, where you just like starch people with them, and and then this becomes the only thing you ever do, right? Like a lot of sub-only guys fall into this trap. I fell into this trap, okay? And this is not a good thing. My phone died, so in order to continue making these stories, I'm gonna have to sit near the wall. Anyway, so the idea here is that basically, if you teach white belts heel hooks early on, they're gonna just get obsessed with it, and that's going to be kind of almost the only thing that they're going to do, right? I do think that there is some sense in which this argument it's definitely a lot better than the safety argument, right? Because if you give people access to a weapon in which they're going to gain, or through which they're going to gain pretty immediate success relative to the various other things that they can learn, some students will just get obsessed with it, right? Because we have a natural temptation, as human beings, to want to gravitate towards things that we are good at, right? And if you find something that's easier to get good at relative to your other options, that's going to grasp a lot of people's attention and, consume it way too much. What our goals are as a coach is to develop well-rounded grapplers. I think people misunderstand what it means to say someone's well-rounded. I'll talk about this in another series of stories, because I think it's like people use it, and I don't really know if they know, like, if they've ever analyzed what well-rounded means. But anyway, just take the basic picture in your head for now and just work with that. So like, we want to develop grapplers that are well-rounded, whatever that means, right? One thing it definitely means is that they don't just do heel hooks, okay? And if you start them off with heel hooks, because those are that they're going to have more immediate success at, they may get obsessed with it. I think this is kind of like, you gotta, as a coach, have a program which constantly forces students to face specific problems that they're going to have to develop a well-rounded skill set to solve. So I think the solution to this problem, again, is not just, don't teach heel hooks to white belts, but rather is, you've got to, as a coach, have a very, like a thought-out program that's going to force your students to face problems that they're going to need to solve. I've talked about this before. Like, all skill ultimately is developed reactively as we confront problems, right? Like, if I don't confront a problem, I can never develop the skill of solving that problem because I've never confronted it, right? So as a coach, one of the things you're doing in the training room is you're trying to design an environment in which people can face problems, right? And they have to be specific problems, right? Can't just be random problems. It has to be specific problems in specific sequences, right? That skill is developed incrementally. And so if you want to develop certain skills, they have to face certain problems incrementally. Here's the good thing. Leg locks can't solve all problems. So if you're worried that your students are going to get obsessed with leg locks and are only going to do leg locks, well, make them solve problems that cannot be solved with leg locks. Well, then they're going to have to work other things than leg locks. So we have two arguments that I think I've pretty fairly refuted, which is first is safety. I think that's a terrible argument. Second is pedagogy. I think that one's a little stronger, and that one I actually have an understanding for coaches who like find that argument compelling, right? So I will add a final note that I think is relevant. I don't think there's any good argument to be made for not teaching your students leg lock defense from day one, okay? So that everyone should be learning, right? Because that isn't going to detract from anything else, right? The pedagogy argument, right? Leg lock defense, it doesn't go into that. So if I teach you leg lock defense, that's not going to tempt you to not learn the other aspects of jiu-jitsu, right? Like that's not really how it works. It would be leg lock offense that would tempt you in that sense, right? Leg lock offense would obsess you to the extent that you wouldn't want to work the other aspects of jiu-jitsu. But again, just design a program that makes it impossible for them to only work leg locks. There you go, problem solved. Okay, so yeah, teach heel hooks white belts. I meant teach heel hooks to white belts. Sorry guys, I'm fucking tired.